What I'm starting with is, in this large washing tub, I'm putting Star San sanitizer. I have hot water. I'm warming up my honey in there a little bit in the tubs to get it easier to pour out when I need it here, and I'm going to set it in the sun for the same reason. But I'm going to put 2 gallons of real hot water in that tub, add some water from the spigot, and I'm going to clean all my equipment prior to starting using a sanitizer. I've got a little bottle of it in there. I'm going to use this one also. I have my brewing kettle set up on the burner here. That's so I can drain out once I get the mead going through it. Right now I put soap in it, sanitizer in it, and I'm scrubbing it with a pad in order to get it clean. I have these that I keep just for brewing, try to keep clean, and keep them in sanitizer. And I pour this out. I'll rinse it. It's up on here so that it's high enough that it can drain into this 5-gallon bucket in order to capture it in this will be the fermentation vessel. Honey will go in here. I'll put a clean spout on it through this hole, and that it'll stay in there for quite some time, fermenting prior to being bottled. Anywhere from weeks to months, even some people do it for years, but that's basic setup, and I'll get a propane tank and connect it to this here in a moment. You may be able to see in my bucket, not sure how well it shows up, but I have about 4.5 gallons of water. The fermenting buckets are kind of handy because they've got markings for how much volume is in it. So I filled it up to 4.5 gallons. I'm going to put that in the boiling vessel here in a minute, and then bring the whole thing up to about 140 degrees. On the Halfdan's Viking mead recipe, it calls for boiling it. I've done it that way, and sometimes it seems to ruin the flavor. And different writers on the topic of making mead have said that better not to boil it, not to get it over 140 degrees. Temperature in many brewing things is very critical as to what's going to happen to the material you're brewing. So I'm going to warm it up to between 140 and 150 degrees. I'm definitely not going to bring it to a boil. And then I'm going to add the honey in along with the spices. And I have a couple bags in here. This one is a hops bag from Brewing Beer. So I may use that for the blueberries if I can fit them in it. I'm not sure if it's big enough. I've got a kind of large quart bag of blueberries to put in. Otherwise, I'll use this, which is a mesh bag, which was for a cider press that I have, and I can put the blueberries in that. I would just put them in it and just boil, bring them to heat them up with the honey loose, but I'm afraid that they'll clog the spout. So that's why I'm doing this. And once I put this in the fermenter, I'll also put the blueberries in to give more flavor in the fermenter as it's fermenting. This is the process for lighting the burner. Turn on the propane, typically listen or check for leaks. You can do that with soap and water too on your joints if you feel it's necessary. I'm doing this in a well-ventilated open space, which I think is important. I'm using a torch to light it. You can adjust the flame with this. And as it's heating up, I use a laser temperature checker. I got this for doing automotive work, for checking the heat on an engine, on radiators, even things like a bearing or something like that. And so you point it, shoots a laser dot. I'm not sure if you can see it due to the light, but saying right now, top of this thing is 85, bottom is 319, and that's after just a couple minutes. So I periodically check the water, saying it's 79 degrees in there, which is the water from the spigot through my hose. And I'm using water from my own well. I've had good success with that. That's the key component in both beer and mead is water. So you want to have a good source of that. They talk about that in brewing classes. Mine seems to work fine. I haven't had it tested other than for bacteria and stuff. It doesn't have any of that, but I haven't tested it for hardness and that kind of thing. But serious brewers would probably do that. So now I'll let this warm up to about 140, 150 degrees, and then I'll be adding the honey. This is roughly a gallon of honey from my brother-in-law who keeps bees. You can buy it on the internet, kind of pricey on the internet on Amazon, but there are sources. Probably the best source would be a local beekeeper. Somebody that is selling it in bulk, that has hundreds of gallons. And by coming and getting it there on site, they're not having to box it and ship it and do all that stuff. My brother-in-law has other friends who are beekeepers who have like 100 hives, and their prices are pretty competitive. But we have an agreement. I'm trading off some things with him. He's giving me a gallon or two of honey every year to make mead. As this is heating up, there's no reason you have to wait till 140 to put stuff in. You can put the honey in and so on. I'm going to be putting in the blueberries. This is my blueberries for mead from, we have a blueberry bush down our driveway a little ways. And this year we had kind of a bumper crop, which is great. I'm going to try and put them in this bag, see how that works. So it looks like these are going to easily fit in here. And then I've got a large spoon, going to be taking the honey and dumping it in there also. I won't leave the camera on for all that. And the ginger calls for like 1 finger's worth of ginger. I've found that to be really a small amount, so I'm probably going to do like one of these great big things at least. I found that the ginger doesn't produce much flavor. So I'm trying to add more on this recipe than the recipe calls for. It also calls for the zest of 1 orange. So I've got a grater. I'm going to grate that in there. May even grate it into the mesh bag. Put these in the mesh bag. Again, it's going to go in the fermenter with it, but it's going to get heated up in here with the water. So I put the bag with the blueberries, I'm up to 150 degrees. This is the bag with the orange zest, which I think you may be able to see is on the top and the blueberries on the bottom. I'm hanging it down in there, trying to keep it from contacting the bottom where the heat is, so it doesn't melt when I turn the heat back on. And now I'm trying to get the honey out of the jar, which is always a challenge. The longer honey has sat, typically the harder it is to get out of the jar. One note my brother-in-law told me about honey is that there's a lot of honey on the market in small, particularly at grocery stores, which comes from China and other places where they don't have controls on inspecting food as much. And a lot of it, instead of being honey, is actually cut with corn syrup, which is, you know, a pretty cheap product. Honey from bees is expensive and difficult to get, and so they cut it with corn syrup. Apparently, you may be able to look on the internet and see ways of doing this. there's ways of tilting the jar and holding it to the light that allows you to see, you know, how quickly it moves in the jar. Will tell you, as you can see, this is real honey. It's sat on the shelf for a few months, and so it even had a kind of a rind on the top of hardened stuff, crystallized stuff. Once I get as much as I can out of the jar, I'm going to put on rubber gloves and put the jar in the hot water and shake it around and try and get the last of it out of the jar. This is a plastic, a food-safe container for honey. So my latest reading on this is 151. I kind of squeezed together the orange, the ginger, and the blueberries. I think you can see some of the blueberry coloring starting to come out into the meat. It will definitely have some blueberry coloring. Whether it'll have blueberry flavoring is usually very mild. But I'm keeping this, got it around 150 or so. I've turned the heat off because the kettle's pretty hot. Sometimes I'm getting a reading of 153 or 157, something like that. But I'm mixing up the cooler water with the hotter water from the bottom. If I let it set for a minute, it'll read about 150. And now I'm going to let it set for about 15 minutes at this temperature. And then I'll let it cool down quite a bit. I may even cover it, I'm not sure. Bees like honey quite a bit, and I've got a bee's nest just around the corner here. I don't want to attract them to the process here. I often get them in my a lot of bees in my cider when I bring that home in a big vat from cider pressing. But if I can avoid having them join me here, that would be good. But the recipe calls for this to be at temperature for at least 10 or 15 minutes. And then the next step on this is you want to cool it down, and I have a tool to cool it with. I can just let it naturally cool down. One of the concerns with that is that you get native yeasts starting in it, which could give it an off flavor. So typically after you've gotten your temperature up, it's kind of killed off any native yeast. That's the point of getting it over 140. You put this in there, cool it down pretty substantially as quickly as possible, get it down to about 100 degrees or 90 degrees, get it in the fermenter and cover it so that native yeasts don't get in it. Native yeast apparently float around in the air, can get in it and give you bad flavors, which I haven't had too many problems with that, but I'm kind of concerned about it. So at any rate, I'm going to be letting this cool down. I'll put this thing down in there, connect it to a hose. It runs cold water through and it cools it down. But I'll start that in about 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm about ready to put the cooler in, the copper, and this just 3/8 copper like you could get from Lowe's or another hardware store. My stuff is cooled down into the 140s, still got the blueberry stuff in it. Might lower that a little bit more. Don't have to worry about the bottom being so hot now because I don't have the flame on anymore. This device is just a piece of copper wire, copper tubing, and I've got a connection to my garden hose. This fitting needs to be tightened up. And you lower it down in, like this, so that the coils are sitting in the hot water. And it's good to have the ends out where if something would come disconnected, you're not pumping cold water into your brew kettle. So I'm going to put it about like this. This one will drain out onto the driveway. Turn it a little bit. So it does that. So cold water will come in here, takes heat out of this, pumps it out here, cools down the wort that's in here, the brewing material. So Halfdan's mead, Halfdan was the son of Ragnar Lodbrok, who invaded England and apparently was killed by being thrown into a pit of snakes, the dad. So they went to avenge him. Eventually Halfdan became the king of Northumbria. He had some famous brothers who were Viking warriors with him. Ivar the Boneless and Sigurd Snake in the Eye was another one, and Bjorn Ironsides, all kind of famous Vikings. The other thing about mead, it plays also a large role in the story Beowulf, and Beowulf is one of those kind of poetic creations that they have. Beo means bee, and wolf means killer. So the one who killed bees was a bear. So it's another word for Bjorn. Bjorn being the Scandinavian or Norse word for bear. So Beowulf means bee killer. So I'm going to tighten this up, turn the water on, cool this down to about 90 to 100 degrees, because that's the pitching temperature you need for yeast. You don't want it to be too hot for the yeast. So it's about 45 minutes later, after having run it on the cooler for about that long, 45, 50 minutes. It's down to 94 degrees, last temperature check. I'm putting it in the fermenter, plastic fermenter. That's a sanitary fermenter, not like a paint tub or anything like that. It's from the company More Beer in Pittsburgh, where I got a lot of this equipment from. It's one of the more recent places that I've used as a vendor. There's others. And I just went over to my local wine shop and got some yeast. I got Lalvin EC118, which is good up to 18% alcohol, and D47. I got 2 packs of each. I'll keep some I keep it in the refrigerator. I'll only use 1 pack of it, and I'll be pitching that shortly. Probably I'm going to take it in and hydrate it, and then pitch the yeast. A thunderstorm's kind of brewing here, so I'm trying to kind of hurry up and get this wrapped up. I'll dump the last of this stuff in there. It's in the brew kettle. And I've already put in the bag that has the orange peel and the blueberries. I tied a knot in it so that it didn't dump out in there. The idea is being to not get it, not have it make a mess and make it hard to strain out or clean out later on. And I'll leave it in this fermenter probably for at least a month or so, maybe more. And then once it's done with primary fermentation, I'll transfer it to a glass carboy, which is a tall glass bottle that also has a stem on it that you can put a bubbler in. So this is my collection of bubblers right here, and I'll be putting this one in. I'll clean it with some sanitizer. Put some fresh water in it from the hose, and then put the lid down. And now this is sealed up. It's at a decent temperature. It's sealed up that bacteria from the air or wild yeast should not get in it. The hopes being that I get a good flavor on the yeast. You can already see that it's got the kind of blueberry coloring on it, which is good. I'm going to set this back out of the way because, like I said, I think the thunderstorm's on its way here shortly. Okay, I'm thinking you can see this. I've got my temperature gauge. Checking the heat on this. This is around 90 degrees, between 87 and 90 degrees. And I'm going to pitch the yeast in there now. This is called hydrating the yeast. And basically it's letting warm water soak into it and begin to activate it. And I'm using a 1/4 cup according to the instructions on the package, which are on the back. Shows you to let it set around 95 degrees, 1/4 cup of water, and you let it set for 20 minutes. So at 420 I'll come back in. You don't actually stir it, you let it soak into the water. And then once this is done, then I'll dump that into the mead, the mead kind of wort, which I'm making, and this should foam up a little bit, and then when I dump it in the mead, it should begin fermenting the mead and turning it from sugar, which is the honey, into alcohol. And hopefully the flavors will follow. And that's basically it for making mead. Pretty simple process. You warm up water, you don't boil it, you add your spices and your honey, and you get it cooled back down. You want to have it, the reason for the temperature issue on this is if it's over, say, 110 degrees, it'll kill the yeast. That's again why you warm up the water in the first place with the honey. Try and kill off stuff that you don't want. We want just this yeast to be working in there. That's the goal. And we don't want it open to the air where other things can get in and contaminate it. So I'm using I've used this before, this EC118, which is, it's good up to 18% alcohol. It's another thing you check with your yeast. Typically you want to look at your recipe and see what yeasts are recommended for what you're trying to make and for your alcohol content. But again, I'll let this soak in, come back in about 20 minutes, dump it into the 5 gallons of stuff I have out in the fermenter, and then keep it at around 65 to 70 degrees. And in a couple weeks it'll be alcohol, and in a couple months it'll be pretty good tasting mead. So that's the process for making mead. So about half an hour has passed, and I just stirred this. I think you can see it's starting to foam up. So I think it's the yeast is active, and I'm going to now take it out to the workshop and put it in the mead, and it should initiate the fermentation process. So by tomorrow or later in the day tomorrow sometime, should be starting to bubble. To show that it's fermenting. Okay, it's the next morning from when I had put the mead in, and I think you might have just seen a bubble on the aerator. The aerator is that thing in the top. And if we watch for a minute, every now and then, see a glug. That's a very good sign. That means that we've achieved fermentation, and I think you can see the blue color in the fermenter, which shows that some of the blueberry stuff did make it into the mead, at least to color it. Whether or not it provides much blueberry flavor with a 1/4 blueberries remains to be seen. But that's a batch of mead in process, and we'll see how it tastes in a month or so. In a couple weeks it will be fermented up. I didn't mention that the fermentation, probably I'll take a specific reading here this morning, find out where its starting gravity is. That will let me know where it will finish out. That's probably another whole topic, which is how to use a hydrometer to test your alcohol levels. And but I'll get a starting measurement here, and then you see how much fermentation happens, and but it will probably finish out around 11% alcohol, maybe slightly less because I didn't have that much honey in this 5 gallons. But there's a batch of mead en route to being a drinkable product for the mead hall.